Today on the Wrestling Roundtable, character versus in-ring skill and the best and worst retirements.
What the fuck is Wrestling Roundtable?
Welcome to the Wrestling Roundtable. I'm the host, Eric Santamaria. I've been working in wrestling a little over 7 years, and I've been watching for 22. Since we taped last time, we've had our 4th anniversary here on YouTube, 4 years, and next time we'll be doing our season finale. But right now, we're going to go to Grizzly Redwood, sitting on my right, which is your left. He's been wrestling for 6 years, but you've been watching for 16.
Yes, sir.
Also, someone who's been around since the beginning, from episode 1 all the way now through 56, Rodney LeConte. Hey, yo, Rod, how's it been?
Good, been good. Celebrated nice 4 years and ready for more.
And you've been watching 22 years, same as myself, but someone who's been wrestling for 12 years now, and he's been all over the world and all over the place, is the man who you may recall from Pro Wrestling Respect. He's with Ring of Honor and lots of other places. He is to my left, which is your right, Delirious. Thanks for coming on the show, and I'm sure it's going to be real interesting, and I'm glad you two guys, of all the wrestlers that have been on the show, are here now, because the first thing that we're going to talk about is the idea of character versus in-ring skill. This really came up because recently on Roundtable Radio we got into a little talk because Will Vafidez said something really in passing, but it stuck with me. He said wrestling doesn't draw. And I really had a problem with that because I don't think it's that easy. When he says doesn't, as in a flat never, I didn't really agree with that. And we got into a little talk on the radio, but it was painfully short. Only a couple minutes, we needed to move on, so I thought, let's expand the talk here. And the question at its basis really goes like this. It's pretty simple. What's more important? What draws money? Is it the charisma, the character, or even the storylines, or someone's in-ring skill? And I'm glad you're on because looking back at your career, you're the perfect person to talk about this, because we know you got through the Ring of Honor school, you started wrestling on preliminary matches and then getting onto the main show, and then it felt like you weren't progressing as far as you should, and then you became this character, Grizzly Redwood the Lumberjack, essentially.
Yep.
And it's done well for you. You've done a really good job with it, but there are some people who criticize the character that doesn't belong in Ring of Honor and for what Ring of Honor's style is supposed to be in their own minds and whatever. But like I said, you've done well with it. So what's your answer? What's more important, charisma or in-ring skill?
I think there needs to be a good balance of both of them, to tell you the truth. I don't think just wrestling on its own won't draw. I think it'll draw to an extent, and I think just character on its own is going to draw to an extent. But I don't think either of them will draw as well as they could if you put both together. I think you need like a total package kind of thing.
Well, the name that Will Vafidez brought up when he was arguing this was Buddy Rogers. And I didn't know if that was the best example for really turning old-timey wrestling into the modern era, because even though, yes, he was the original Nature Boy, the first person you think of, you go back to the 50s in the Dumont Network, is Gorgeous George.
Right.
He was of the contemporary group of Lou Thez and those sort of wrestlers who were really legit, hookers, really. And I don't mean it that way. I mean fish hooking, not that sort of hooking. They could really mess you up. And that's what a lot of wrestlers were at the time. But then Gorgeous George comes along. He's got a flamboyant gimmick with the hairpins, the hair dye, the robe, and the fresh imported Florida air, which I loved, and really started kicking in this new perception of wrestling. Because if you go back to the origins of wrestling, you go back to Joe Stetcher and Ed Strangler Lewis having 5.5-hour long matches, and people were getting turned off to all these long grappling contests. And that's really the genesis of pro wrestling, splitting from the legit and becoming sports entertainment, as it's called now. Does wrestling history itself show that character is more important?
I think it's just been the change over the generations. Once television came, I think that really changed how people view wrestling. Back then, all the old-time wrestlers, the grapplers, the legit guys who a lot of them came from amateur wrestling, the gotchas, they would have hour-long matches and people would still be engaged into this. That would not work with today's ADD fan era. I think in-ring character is what draws. That's what people want to see. That's what sells the t-shirts. You don't have t-shirts of names of moves. You have t-shirts of catchphrases. You have t-shirts of characters, whatever they're trying to promote. But wrestling is an asset now. I think it also depends on the character. If your character is you're a great wrestler, someone like Kurt Angle, who is really a great mixture of both great character and a great wrestler, and who's someone who in his character says, I'm a better wrestler than you, as opposed to other wrestlers say, I will beat you, and just throws insults. It really depends on how the character works the wrestling angle.
Well, what do you think, Delirious?
There's gonna come up from here, and Delirious is Delirious, no character, no personality, this is who I am, but it all depends on the situation, because all of it in Japan, you have Misawa and Kawada and all these people, there's no character, no personalities, it's a stronger work rate people. So again, that's over there, so in Japan, it's a stronger work rate, but in here, the bottom line is personalities, which are all in the room, it's like, people come in and see, anytime it's our personalities, and there's but it's happening, so it's like a Grizzly Redwood, say with the cool combination, package, we add it all together, boom, 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 then we got the rising star, and all the best. In America, personality was Japan, maybe so we're working business, and baby,
Well, I think he brings up a good point somehow, but I think he brings up a good point because my counterpoint to Will Vafides' wrestling doesn't draw thing was they like to easily target, let's call them the smart mark favorites, the guys like Dean Malenko, Dynamite Kid, He Who We Do Not Speak Of, etc. But if you watch back Nitros from 96, 97, and granted, the product itself is hot at the time, so everyone was over to a degree, but you watch these guys like Malenko, the scientific wrestlers, they get a great reaction. And isn't there something to be said about someone...
I think they're two different audiences. It really depends on the audience, like how he mentioned in Japan.
He mentioned Japan?
He mentioned Japan. Yeah. It really depends on the audience, too, because I feel like that WCW crowd was more into wrestling than what we had in the Northeast.
Okay, but how about ECW? Because people always like to say it was more than just hardcore stuff. They had Malenko and Guerrero Classic and blah, blah, blah. But they would also cheer for guys like Sid when they showed up. They're like, we hate WWF and all this other bullshit. But once the Dusties and Sids and whoever would show up, they'd pop for them just the same.
Yeah, even ECW, they had huge personalities. I think the personalities of people what drew people to ECW. It wasn't all just the wrestling, all the hardcore wrestling. They had all the great wrestling, which they did. But they had all these larger-than-life characters there. Well, who could also deliver in the ring, but it was the characters that brought people in.
Well, I don't know about the great wrestling because a lot of it really doesn't hold up.
Well, yeah.
But
to the small market, to the niche audience, I think it works.
Okay, but fine. But I think he's got a great point because the wrestling really wasn't the greatest. And it does bleed over into the Attitude Era and the stuff that we see now where people just pop for finishers, high spots, and hardcore shit. But people were into the character, the aura of Taz. People were into the aura of Sabu, the character of the Dudleys. I mean, they had some fine matches to be sure. It's not all crap or anything. But I'm just saying that the characters are something that's really overlooked when looking back at ECW history.
It's what's going to draw people in. It's what makes people want to watch, I think.
But isn't there something to be said also for someone like Daniel Bryan, because people always like to say he's in that vein.
Who has a boatload of actual personality when he wrestles as well. It all carries together.
But what people always look to is the scientific wrestlers. But that's not going to draw the chain wrestling and blah, blah, blah. But isn't the idea that wrestling can be someone's gimmick, I'm a good wrestler, enough in the sense, and I don't mean it's restricted to just guys like Malenko or Benoit or whatever. Mysterio is the same way. People like him because he's a good wrestler in the ring. They like to see what he does. It's the same way with even...
But it depends what kind of wrestling. Mysterio has very animated wrestling. They like the flying stuff and everything. I don't know if you're talking about the lucha style or the more technical ground-based wrestling that...
Both. I'll even go further than that. Because when you see a freak show, let's say like Yokozuna or Andre the Giant, the whole idea is like, whoa, what can this guy do? They want to see what he does in the ring and how he matches up.
And that's kind of what drew him too, because when you see this guy doing his leg drops and his belly to bellies and all his moves that people never seen before, I think that's another thing too. When people break out moves that are very unorthodox, like someone like Brock Lesnar, who didn't speak a word, but they see this big guy who's athletic, who's doing nip-ups and all these great moves and counters, I think that's what draws and helps build the character too.
Okay, but people always say that wrestling doesn't draw, right? And that it's the characters and stuff. But don't people want to see the Hardys wrestle? What was Goldberg's thing? We want to see him wrestle. It's completely different styles, but isn't wrestling the end game?
Oh, absolutely. It's pro wrestling. Wrestling has to be the end game.
They always say that when you turn on the TV and you watch pro wrestling, you want to see pro wrestling. Of course, there's everything that comes around with pro wrestling, but the bottom line is pro wrestling is the thing you want to say. When you go to a basketball game, you want to go when you see basketball. You don't want to see football when you go to a basketball game. When you assess and you tune in to go about anything else, and pro wrestling, people want to see pro wrestling, blah, blah, blah. And everything else that comes with it, with the glitz and glamour, it'll be there, and people like that. Bottom line is the pro wrestling.
I think I caught some of that.
Yeah.
Although I think Tebow has a gimmick now too, so that's kind of a different. But on that note, we'll be right back after this break.
Sky high! Everything just sky high. Prices going off the ceiling. Let me tell you right now, but there's one thing that you can depend on. That's $5 wrestling. Wrestling's so bad that it's good. Listen, this fabulous collection, it's all available on highspots.com. Take a look at it. It's the hottest ticket in town. And I'm gonna tell you something. You'll get your money's worth and more out of this. And I got my main man here, the one-man gang. Hey, Slick! $5 for this? Are you kidding me? $5 for wrestling. I cannot believe it. The one-man gang holding $5 DVD.
Hi, this is the American Dragon Bryan Danielson, the best wrestler in the world, and you're watching the best wrestling talk show in the world, the Wrestling Roundtable.
Welcome back to the Wrestling Roundtable. Join us Tuesdays on blogtalkradio.com/Wrestling Roundtable at 11 p.m. 347-857-4647 is the number to call to share your thoughts, opinions, and questions with the panel. And you can check out iTunes, where you have the entire archive of Wrestling Roundtable, along with Blog Talk Radio, and we're simulcast on Go Fight Live, so we have plenty of ways for you to listen to the show. Joining the panel to my right, which is your left, is Will Evan Brooks. First up, fan of 22 years. And Martin LeConte rejoining the panel. No, Rodney didn't shrink. Martin is back, fan of 13 years, and we were talking about the idea of what is more important, charisma or character versus in-ring skills. So the argument I used against Will Buffett when he brought this up was when he said wrestling doesn't draw. I said, you're crazy, because if I told you that 1990s Bret Hart was going to wrestle Kurt Angle on a pay-per-view tomorrow, like with a time machine or some shit, you're telling me that wouldn't sell in and of itself just for people to see the match, which is the idea. So do you think that wrestling, just a match, doesn't have any backstory, any whatever? I mean, it could, but nothing elaborate, let's say. But just the idea of these two guys wrestling, can that draw, or do you need a storyline? Do you need an over-the-top character?
You don't always need it, but it helps sometimes. Mm-hmm. Like, we all have dream matches. Well, all us fans, we want to see, like, oh, I'd love to see Bret Hart versus Kurt Angle. I'd love to see the Rockers versus the Hardys, or like anything of like styles that you think that would have been a great match to see. But at the same time, yes, some guys do need that character because the in-ring skills aren't as up-to-date as everybody else, so not as great. So some guys need characters to rely on or be able to talk. But you don't always need it. You can be entertaining and just wrestle, and everybody will love you.
Exactly. I agree with the same thing, because there's wrestlers today who don't really wrestle that good, but they have that big charisma and that big character to have them up. Look at Randy Orton, for an example.
I don't know that's the best example. Because
or John Cena, you know. Like,
I don't think that's a great example either, because when you get to guys like who can't wrestle, so to speak, guys, people say that about Cena today, Warrior and Hogan in years past, things like that. Well, I'm not going to even get into the whole argument of, well, Hogan's a better worker in Japan. I think it's a very distorted view of what worker actually means. Hogan is not to the degree of, let's say, a Road Dogg who just came back on Monday. He's the first guy I thought of when we thought of this talk, because this is a guy who was literally just a catchphrase. He's not a bad wrestler per se, but can you tell me any Road Dogg classic matches that didn't have like 5 other people in it and chairs and shit? Like, I mean, like a one-on-one sort of thing. There's really not that many. This guy was a catchphrase and nothing more, really. But yet he shows up on Raw, and the audience, the half of it didn't watch. Back then they were kids, but the half that stuck around and remembered the Attitude Era popped like huge, and they're leaving comments on our group page on Facebook like, oh, Road Dogg, like they have these fond memories. He was only a catchphrase and a couple chords on some music. So do you think that really counterbalances the whole idea of what we were trying to say?
This Road Dogg is coming over here, but what they're saying is Road Dogg is 1, 2, 3 kid in your house, so it's one on one. I remember that one. But anything we're going to say is the Road Dogg and guys in his catchphrase, whatever it says, but it worked for him. He was going to go, it works for people. We can see he's a great worker, great wrestler, whatever. He's going to come over here and get his sunshine. But again, but it all works for the goes on like game.
All right. Well, getting back to what I was saying about Hulk Hogan, there's guys that can work a good match for whatever they have or whatever they choose to do. And I think that's more along the lines of what Hogan and Cena sort of do. I don't think they're bad. They're just different. And when it comes to a mixture of both, I think someone who really distorted this perception is The Rock, who just came back. Because what people always forget about The Rock, he was a great wrestler too. He was a great athlete. But what do people remember the most? The catchphrases and the character stuff. So that starts to become emphasized more to the point where people are like, well, you need to have a catchphrase to get over. You need to have mic skills, and that's fucking bullshit. The Hardys and the TLC teams from 2000 got over and became an attraction, became a draw without really any promo and not so much a storyline either. It was just 3 teams having hardcore matches, and depending on the match style, I guess. But still, the fact is those people drew in and of themselves. Rob Van Dam and Jerry Lynn had a series of matches that really, until later, when by the time they started doing storyline stuff with like Scotty Riggs and shit, who gave a shit? But I just mean like the first several matches they had, they were like, wow, people need to see those sort of matches. It was really not based on any even promos so much.
Mike Awesome, Masato Tanaka.
Right.
They didn't have much of a storyline, but every time they had a match, everybody wanted to see it.
Exactly. And getting back to The Rock, do people, and there are some who say, like, I wish I could have seen a confrontation between The Rock and Ric Flair on the mic, so to speak. But how often do you hear, I want to see a dream promo or a dream match? I think dream match is a lot more common.
You never hear it, but you need that promo to make that match.
Okay, sure.
Not always, though. There's plenty of times where all you need is a simple run-in, or
But
a
it depends
simple
on the
betrayal,
style.
or this or that. You don't always need the promo. Promo helps, and a promo can really set the match.
But but those 8 wrestlers need it. Like everybody else, you could skip off that sometimes. But if you were to do like Rock and Ric Flair, like if they were gonna wrestle,
because they talk so well, you would need that
big build up because of their characteristics.
But speaking of Rock, what about Hogan and Rock? If they had just done that confrontation face to face on Raw and nothing else, I don't think there would be any less buys.
No, because they built their big charismas in the past, so people already know who they were.
So it's based on history.
On history.
Hogan's coming up a lot, and when you think of charisma, obviously he's one of the top guys. But if the whole purpose of wrestling is to make money, make the most money, it's a business, as we're constantly reminded. Aren't the guys who are the characters end up drawing more anyway? Cena sells the merchandise, Hogan. But speaking of Hogan, he was, among many people, ripping off superstar Billy Graham. And when you think of guys in his contemporary, superstar Billy Graham, Dusty Rhodes, aren't those guys more predicated on selling tickets with their charisma and their star power?
All right. Jenny is going to come over here, so, but don't forget about the Boogie Man, you'll be fine, and Mosaic, and all these people, and of course, and then all again, so everybody, they're going to go, oh, put it in, sorry, being again.
Okay, well, I think you said something I could pick up on there. And speaking of Boogie Woogie Man and those sort of guys, like Kamala is a wrestling legend, and how many Kamala matches do you remember? So that's another one based on exactly based on character. And I think what we're getting at, this is definitely not a black and white issue, I don't think. So saying something doesn't draw can't always be true. There's always exception to the rules, and rules are made to be broken, so to speak. And anyone who says, like, this is a rule, it must always happen, is usually wrong. But I think there's a great middle ground, because we mentioned Rock, we mentioned Ric Flair. There are guys who are right in the middle there who are not only great wrestlers in the ring, but they also are great characters on the mic outside of it.
And what do we call them? Legends.
Yes, we do. I mean, there's so many great examples outside of Flair and The Rock. I mean, there's Undertaker, who wrestled a lot of great classic matches against a variety of opponents, but a lot of that is based on character. Eddie Guerrero is one of those worker guys who still, no matter where he wrestled, in whatever size venue or any part of the world, really, connected to the audience somehow. And then, unfortunately, we just lost him this year. One of the best of all time, Macho Man Randy Savage. Any others you could think of?
Stone Cold Steve Austin.
One of the biggest ever. Which is funny because when Austin was really getting popular, it wasn't for his wrestling at all. No, he was a great wrestler, But he broke his neck at SummerSlam 97. And after that, he wrestled a much different style than he did before his Stunning Steve, or even after he had the neck surgery and he came back and had those great matches in 2001. At his peak, he was doing punch kick, hardcore brawl main events, and it really didn't matter so much that it was all the same style match.
Because most of that characteristic brought him up. Like, when people, still to this day, when you hear the glass break, everybody is going to be on their feet.
Well, another great example, though, is like Bret Hart. His character was himself. He didn't need an over-top character, but his character was, I'm the best wrestler in the world, I do everything right, and I'm going to make you submit whether you like it or not. Give me anybody, put anybody in front of me, I'm doing it. So maybe that wasn't a character in the over-the-top character, but it was still a character.
Basic.
Yes, basic as it was, but it was him, maybe like a characterization of himself, but it worked, and it was one of my favorite wrestlers of all time.
It gets coming down and it's like better is of that's here, but you amplify it a little bit more. It's a heartbreaking show because it is picking going to come over here, but he loses to being an asshole, so you just elevate it a little bit more. So he's a little bit of shit. So when he's on TV, to get someone gets kind of a time. But it's like most people, he says, go back into Drew Money with some time at a big chance, and he didn't really was saying that he really puts, but the announcers, and put it over. So again, the chance you could be some, but other people outside sources they come and they have get some guy.
I got another great example. What about Taz?
I got a better one for you. Chris Jericho and Shawn Michaels. I think he may have mentioned Shawn Michaels.
I heard it HBK near somewhere.
But they are tied together because those are two guys that were pretty well respected among their peers and smart marks with the workership, but still connected to the people with their characters and their in-ring skills. Did they make the money Cena and Hogan did? No, but they became big enough names and made a good living. So, like I said, it's not a black and white issue, but I guess best and worst can be to a degree, and that's what we're going to move on to next. Best and worst retirements when we come back.